Welcome to Chess Dog. My name is John Montgomery, and today's chess adventure takes us to the Houston Summer Championship, where we have a young, very talented player. You might not have heard of him, but you will hear about him soon. His name is Ryo Chen. He was, I believe, the third youngest master in American history. He is currently 11 and a half with a Fide rating of 2358. And in the championship game of this tournament, he's going up against International Master Ron Burnett, who is more than 40 years older than Ryo. International Master Burnett has the white pieces. Ryo has the black pieces. Let's jump right in. D4, knight f6, c4, g6, knight c3, bishop g7. Ryo plays the King's Indian defense. e4, d6, f3. International Master Burnett plays the Saemisch system against the King's Indian, and you'll notice he has that really strong pawn structure, pawns at e4, f3, and g2. Very rigid, and e4 is very strong. The only downside is that the knight and bishop on the king side can get in each other's way, so there is some coordination issues, but the center is in good shape. Ryo castles. Bishop e3, defending d4, which is the most sensitive square in white's position. Ryo plays c5, and as a rule of thumb in the King's Indian, when your opponent as white develops their queen's bishop from c1 early, c5 is usually the best way to attack the center because the b2 pawn is no longer protected, so you're trying to open up the long diagonal to exploit the dark squared bishop's absence from the queen side. Knight ge2, protecting d4, queen to a5. What black would like to happen is for white to play d5, lock the center, and then advance on the queen side. But the international master wants to keep that center fluid, the best decision. Ryo takes on d4, knight to b3, attacking the queen and also the d4 pawn. That's why he can play that move and not lose a piece. Ryo moves the queen away to h5. An odd square for the queen, but it's actually the main move here. And after, it can cause some irritation to white's kingside pawns. And after white recaptures on d4, we basically have a standard Maroczy Bind, the kind you would get in an accelerated dragon, for example, of the Sicilian. The only difference being the queen on h5 is a little awkwardly placed, but it also can cause some trouble for white if white's not careful. So let's watch what takes place. What white wants to do is for these pawns on c4 and e4 to keep black from breaking free with either the d5 push or the b5 push. Black, on the other hand, wants to arrange those moves if possible. Knight to c6 developing, bishop e2, and Ryo decides to check at h4. The idea being he wants to just sort of irritate white's pawn structure a little bit. White plays g3. Now, if white were to play bishop f2, black can play queen to g5, hitting that g5 square, and after castling, he can play the knight to h5, the bishop might be able to go to h3, and black would have a nice position. So white goes ahead and plays g3, queen to h3, threatening to get in there on g2, king to f2, and the king may look like it's in some trouble, but it's actually pretty safe on the f2 square. Ryo exchanges pieces. He has less space. He would like to get some pieces off the board. Bishop e6 hitting the c4 pawn. Queen to d2. Rook f to c8, hitting that pawn a second time. And now the IM has to protect it with b3. a6, planning that very break we were talking about earlier. b5, trying to open up the queen side. Rook a to d1, continuing to centralize. Knight to d7. Now, usually, the dark squared bishop in a King's Indian is the pride and joy of the position. But in this case, Ryo is willing to exchange it off because he sees that white has dark squared weaknesses in his position. A knight, for example, could settle on c5 or e5. So he's okay getting rid of that dark squared bishop because he feels that white's dark squared bishop is even more valuable. Bishop g7, king g7, knight d5. Now, we're starting to see the real strategy develop. White's willing to let black take his knight with his bishop, and that would leave black with a better minor piece. The knight would be able to get access to some good squares, while white would have a bad bishop on e2. But in exchange, white gets a big space advantage and a target on e7. Bishop d5, e d5. Now, instead of playing knight to c5, Ryo plays knight f6. He could have jumped in already with b5, even though it's a sacrifice. Takes, and knight e5. And black has a lot of attacking potential in this position in exchange for a pawn. The pawn at a2 is currently attacked. The queen has to defend it. The h5 pawn can march forward to attack on the king side. Also, black's queen can move to f5, which threatens knight g4 checks, and also would defend a rook coming in on c2. So this is a way that he could have gone. That would have been a pretty effective pawn sacrifice. He plays knight to f6 to keep some pressure on d5. Rook de1, aiming at the most vulnerable position in black, vulnerable square in black structure, e7. b5. He wants to undermine white's pawn structure. Queen to d4. If white were to take, takes. Now that some of those similar ideas. Queen to f5. The queen would support an invasion of the rook on c2. It attacks d5 twice. And if bishop to c6, trying to defend that pawn with tempo, knight to g4 check, king g2, knight e5, attacking the f3 square. He defends rook hf1, excuse me. Knight takes c6, pawn takes, rook takes c6. And black's activity versus white queenside pawns, this position is pretty balanced. So white plays the queen to d4, centralizes the queen, pins the knight on f6. The queen comes back to d7 to help protect the e7 pawn and the b5 pawn. g4, threatening g5, which would win a piece because that knight on f6 is pinned. So Ryo decides to take queens off the board. He figures, again, I have less space, get pieces off, go into an endgame. The International Master plays king to e3. He doesn't want to exchange the queens off on Ryo's terms. He says, Ryo can exchange queens, and I'll get a nice centralized king in the endgame. Ryo plays h5, attacking white's kingside structure. g5, queen to d4 check, king captures d4, knight to d7, f4 to keep the knight out of e5. But now we see that white has more space, but the strength of that knight is quite real here, and he has access to that c5 square, so you get a knight on c5 versus a bad bishop, and black probably has a slight pull here. b4, claiming that c5 square for his knight permanently. The bishop goes to d3, so the rook is now threatening to take on e7. The rook defends the pawn. Rook e2, planning to double on the e-file to attack e7 that way, and then also defending a2 laterally, which is not an issue yet, but could become one. The knight jumps into the nice juicy c5 square and prepares to advance the a-pawn to create weaknesses on the queen side. Bishop c2, he wants to keep that bishop. By the way, if you're getting value from this video, be sure to click the like button and subscribe if you haven't already. Ryo begins the march of the a-pawn. Ron Burnett plans to play f5. He wants to open up the f-file, get some activity for his heavy pieces to compensate for the activity black has on the queen side. a4, pawn takes, knight takes a4, and f5. Now, it might have been a good idea for white to go ahead and grab that knight here. The knight's pretty strong, but he decided to go ahead and try to break through with f5 right now. Ryo returns the knight back to the nice square it is on. fg6, rookie to f2. So white has quite a bit of activity on the king side. He plays e5 check, but let's look and see. Actually, Ryo could have gotten away with taking the pawn on a2. It looks very dangerous, and it would be hard to play this over the board. But after rook f7, king g8, bishop takes g6, rook takes h2, as scary as this looks, white does not have a mate, and black's b-pawn is extremely dangerous, and black's probably a bit better here. But optically, it's pretty scary, and I don't blame him for not going into it. e5 check. Pawn takes. Knight takes e6 with check, also forking and attacking the g5 pawn. King to d5. White says, well, I'm going to activate my king. It's always a tricky thing in the endgame. You want an active king, but your king can still get into some trouble. But the International Master says, I'm ready to activate my king, get him in the middle of the board. Ryo takes the pawn, h4, rook to a5, check. International Master Burnett plays king to c6. He didn't feel comfortable with king d6, rook e6, and black's pieces begin to get quite active here. So he plays king to c6, using black's own pawn as a shield. Knight goes to e4, rook f7 check, king h6, rook 1 to f4. He wants to kick the knight away from that nice central square. Ryo plays rook to c5 check. Then the king moves to d7. Then rook c to e5, defending the knight. Bishop takes e4, rook takes e4, and here we have just a double rook endgame. White takes the pawn on d6, rook to e2, attacking the a2 pawn, c5. So white has a very powerful c-pawn. Black's going to have to deal with it. Ryo's going to have to find a way to deal with that c-pawn. Rook to d2 check, king to c7, pushes the king in front of the pawn, making it a little bit harder to advance. Takes the pawn on a2. White takes the pawn on b4. So we have this c-pawn versus this 2 versus 1 majority on the king side. Rook to a7 check, rook to b7, rook b7, king to b7. Now, black has to find a way to deal with this c-pawn. So Ryo develops a plan, probably the best plan in the position. What he decides to do is he's going to take his rook, capture the h4 pawn, then come back and sacrifice the rook for the c-pawn. Then he's going to use his g and h pawns versus white's rook and advance those pawns and hopefully be far enough ahead in tempo that white is not going to be able to stop those pawns from advancing. I don't think black can't really win here, but he might be able to use those pawns to hold the draw. Let's see how this plan works. Rook to e4, c6, rook h4, c7, rook to b4 check, get a check in, king c6, rook c4 check, king d6. And he doesn't take the pawn right away. He wants to take it as late as he possibly can. He begins his pawns moving on the king side. He wants to gain as many tempos there as possible. Rook to f8, king to g5. Now, c8 queen. Rook takes queen, rook takes rook. And so here's the battle. Is white going to be able to stop these pawns from advancing and win the game with his extra rook? Let's see. h3, king to e5, king to g4, rook to c4 check, king to g3, rook to c3 check. Now, a winning attempt here might be to play rook to c1, controlling the queening square, and trying this old trick. h2, king e4, king g2, say rook to c2 check, king g1, king f4, h1 queen, then king to g3. And it actually looks bad for black here. White is threatening mate with rook to c1. If the king goes to f1, rook to c1 would just win the queen. And the queen doesn't have any checks. So it looks like it's bad news. However, the International Master did not go into this variation because of this move, queen to h6. The queen controls the queening square, and the tides have been completely reversed. Black is actually winning in this variation. So he goes ahead and plays rook to c3 check, king to g4, and a draw was offered and accepted. So the International Master and Fide Master Ryo Chen had a draw. They tied for first. And also, let me not be remiss, I got to tell you, Alexander Elliott, who was rated only 1840 when the tournament began, he finished with 4 points. He gained 130 rating points. So he actually tied with them. So big congrats to Alexander Elliott as well, and Ryo Chen and Ron Burnett for their success tying for first at the Houston Summer Championship. Thank you for joining us at Chess Dog. Hope to see you again soon. Bye.